Hello and welcome to the ICMA Education and Training Present series, Let's Talk Markets. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm a Senior Director at ICMA in Market Practice and Regulatory Policy, and I'm here with Jen Cresswell, Counsel from A&O Sherman, who's also the Steering Committee member for the UK Women's Network. You've now been involved with the IWN for 10 years. How would you describe it to our audience?
So the ICMA Womens Network is a global network, so it of course leverages off the ICMA membership, so it's a truly global network, and there are active committees in 14 of the different regions, and each of those is led by an international steering committee member. And it's also an impartial and open forum, and I think that's a really key strength. Of course, as you know, Katie, ICMA member firms come in all shapes and sizes, so the ICMA Women's Network provides a forum to discuss issues which women may be facing across the capital markets, regardless of the firm they're at or the role that they're doing. And the ICMA Women's Network aims to encourage, support and inspire women at all stages of their career, and in doing so to further the aim of gender equality within the bond markets. I should say that it also welcomes participation from all genders and ethnicities, which obviously is essential in achieving positive, sustainable change. I think the membership is around about 4,000 now and counting. And if I had to sum the ICMA Women's Network up in a few words, I'd probably say networking, skills, support and career development. So Katie, why did ICMA set up the Women's Network?
Well, good question. Around about 10 years ago this year, actually, it was in 2014, myself and colleagues set the network up because we knew we needed a forum in which to discuss issues which are sort of pertinent to women in financial services, and you know that would acknowledge issues that women face in their careers. But I don't think we ever expected it to become quite the phenomenon that it has. We'd all had sort of experiences that led us to wanting to set up the network. Back then, we certainly didn't anticipate the massive strides that have been made for female or for women in financial services. Things are very, very different now, I would say, compared to 10 years ago. They've changed significantly. There is myriad evidence that, you know, the benefits of having women and all genders, in fact, in the workforce, and particularly in senior positions. The importance of things like neurodiversity, having people from different socio-economic backgrounds, having people with all sorts of abilities, etc., is much better understood now and is very much welcomed. And firms are generally accommodating all sorts of different work permutations, you know, working from home, working part-time, flexible, agile working of different sorts, working from a different country or even a different continent in some cases, and many other different types of arrangements. And I think also that racial and gender and sexual harassment is no longer tolerated. And we're now starting to see a lot of scrutiny around the gender pay gap issue, which, to be frank, is certainly not, has not been narrowed to the extent it should be, but at least there's an awareness around it. So I think for all those reasons, that's why we initially thought that the Women's Network would be a good thing to do. But I mean, I would say, Jen, and you'd probably agree with me, that the ICMA Women's Network job hasn't been done. I mean, I think we've still got quite a way to go.
Yeah, no. I mean, conditions and cultures have obviously changed and improved for women, but there is more to do. And just focusing on the UK for a moment, I suppose there's two recent reports that it's probably worth mentioning. Firstly, the House of Commons Treasury report, which covered underrepresentation of women in senior positions in the city, and that noted that in 2024, just 12% of named fund managers in the UK are women. That maternity remains a significant barrier to women in financial services, with too many women leaving financial services after they've had children. And also that the financial services sector, and you've alluded to this, has the largest gender pay gap of any sector in the UK economy, and that gap is closing at a glacial pace. The second report I think that's worth mentioning is the most recent Women in Finance Charter annual review, which was published in March this year. And that reported that in 2023, female representation in senior management among charter signatories averaged 35%. And that does represent, there's a consistent annual rise since the launch of the charter, but at the pace that's been happening, signatories won't achieve an average of 50% until 2038, and even that's not across all sectors. So, there are some interesting findings there. But Katie, how do you think the ICMA Women's Network can help?
Well, to be fair, the findings that you've mentioned are UK based, but we know from discussing with the ICMA Women's Network Steering Committee, which is truly international, that these issues are equally applicable in their regions as well as in the UK. So I think, as I said earlier, awareness has generally increased and become front and centre, and women are now feeling a lot more empowered and able to identify and call out unfair practices. But I think also fundamentally the issue is that men are still perceived very differently to women, and cultures continue to discriminate against women. They just do. Maybe not consciously, but I think subconsciously. We've all been aware of times when you might have been talked over, or you might have had somebody explaining something to you when you fully understand it, or you're not credited with an idea that you might have come up with, somebody else has sort of taken the credit, or women who don't have the confidence to apply for jobs when they're not maybe qualified to apply for them. They just wouldn't even consider doing that. So I think that the Women's Network is very much a safe space for us to explore the issues which are faced by women in financial services every day. And it holds people back from fulfilling their full potential. It's also very much a support system where women can share experiences and draw from each other's lived experiences. They can pick up tips and learn some life hacks and maybe learn skills to add to their arsenal to boost their own confidence. And I think it's important also that they can learn resilience and understand that, it's okay to fail. We all have to fail. And by failing, that's how you learn from your failures and you pick yourself up again. So all these very important issues, I think, are addressed very much by the ICMA Women's Network. Yeah.
And of course, there is still a shortage of female senior role models. And I think one of the interesting things that I've learned since joining the International Steering Committee is that the themes across the regions are similar, but they're not identical. Yeah. And I guess, the global nature of the network helps with that appreciation. In some regions, there are obviously even fewer senior role models who are women, and they may have experienced challenges themselves because things may be progressing at a very different pace of change. For example, in some regions, things like childcare, maternity leave, and then returning to work can significantly impact career development and can be quite career limiting. So the ICMA Women's Network encourages women of all levels, including similar women, to get involved, to stand up and stand out, to be good leaders, to inspire, offer support, feedback, mentoring, reassurance, and to give and receive good advice. And I alluded to this earlier. We encourage the participation of men. They are enablers of change, and we can't have the conversation in a vacuum without men in the room. So, Katie, do you want to describe some of the topics that the ICMA Women's Network has addressed and which have really stood out for you?
Sure. Well, first of all, just to say that the ICMA Women's Network delivers mostly live events, and they range from practical workshop styles to panel discussions among influential industry figures. The events, we try to keep them region-led because, as you say, some of the topics can be very different in the regions and at different paces. We try to ensure the events are thought-provoking and pertinent to the audience, and that they hopefully result in meaningful discussion, if not actual change. Networking is also very important. Is key to the ICMA Women's Network offerings. But to your question, there've been so many events that we've done actually. In terms of standouts, I would probably say I really enjoyed the social media masterclass that we did, which encouraged people to have a social media profile and taught them how to actually have something that's meaningful and serious and how to use social media to their own advantage. We also had a great session on impact coaching, which was how to have a positive impact with clients and with peers. I enjoyed the one where we looked at the human science behind unconscious bias. We've all heard about unconscious bias. This went into the actual human condition behind it, which was really interesting. And also it talked about how unconscious biases affect networking, career progression, etc. And then recently we did a session on the future of work, which was really pertinent because it was addressing how to keep pace with the sort of competing tensions of AI and technology and what we can do to help our own careers. And that might be, for instance, undertaking additional education or learning additional skills, etc. But actually sometimes it's really just nice to listen to senior figures and junior figures, I would have to say, talking about their pathways, about how they've got to where they've got to, about the challenges that they've faced, about their lived experiences and their anecdotes of being in the markets. I think there's a lot to be learned from just listening to inspirational people. What would you say were your favourite events?
So rather than talk about the topics that I think we've covered, which have been many, I'd like to highlight two other ICMA Women's Network, I think I described them as specials, which were employed in the UK and I think in some other regions. And firstly, and you've sort of alluded to this, Katie, are structured networking that takes place after each event where you turn up, there's the panel, there's the speaker, you get put into groups and then you move around the room in your groups, which I think encourages discussion with people that are outside of your usual kind of sphere of contacts. And that's really good for building your networking skills, practicing your elevator pitch, and meeting new people in a supportive and friendly environment. So I really enjoy those. And the second thing is I'm excited that in the UK that we are starting to arrange some low-key, informal, pay-for-self drinks or breakfast to try and make the most out of the network so that we can get together outside of the main events that we have. So I would say that people should be obviously keeping an eye out on the ICMA Women's Network LinkedIn page, for example, where, Katie, I know you'll be posting details of these more informal get-togethers.
So, Jen, taking a step away from the ICMA Women's Network for a moment, what do you think the main enablers for gender equality are?
Well, look, there's lots of good things going on at the moment. I'm thinking about things through a UK lens, of course. There is a real awareness of gender inequality and I think a genuine desire for change. Many organisations will have gender inclusive policies and will be striving for an inclusive culture. But in addition to those things, sometimes I think it's just the simple stuff around support, things we've talked about already that anyone can do, because making a difference to an individual woman can help collectively support change. So it's things like seniors sharing a top tip on how to handle a situation, or giving a platform to a junior woman to help her build her profile, or sharing thoughts on skills development. So, for example, around confidence or resilience, that kind of thing. Katie, what about you?
Well, I think for me, it starts at grassroots level, at school and at home, really. I think the language we teach our kids to speak from an early age, we maybe unconsciously end up sending our kids down certain pathways. And I think that some of the language we use can actually perpetuate gender conformity. It's very hard to step away from that, however, but research has shown that kids from an early age associate science with males and masculine traits, and that subjects like English are considered to be less masculine because of their perceived irrelevance to sort of male jobs, and the fact that, you know, there's more emphasis on emotional content. So I think, you know, stereotyping subject choice like this can then impact on higher educational choices and ultimately career choices. So kids are maybe less likely to fulfill the potential that they might have had they not had those sort of subconscious pathways driven into them at a young age. But I also think we need to be really mindful of going too far too soon. I think there's a danger that young men will start to feel disenfranchised by gender equality, and that the pendulum is maybe, or perceived as maybe swinging too far away from them, so that they just don't know how to be and who to be. And I think the danger there is that they might start to undermine the gender equality agenda. So rather, I think it's important to carry boys with us, boys and young men with us on the journey, as opposed to trying to beat them, really.
So, wrapping up, Katie, with your experiences learned through the ICMA Women's Network, what do you think are the main challenges for women in the period ahead?
Well, I think that breaking down the stereotypes and the biases is going to continue to be difficult, particularly in the financial services industry, where you've got really entrenched frameworks and expectations. But I hope that efforts such as those of the ICMA Women's Network will help to try and break those barriers down and empower women to do the same for themselves, which are, you know, maybe the ICMA Women's Network, it's a small step towards achieving that. I also think, I slightly worry that firms' efforts in terms of gender equality and diversity, equity and inclusion generally might start to lose momentum and just become more of a box ticking exercise. So I think it's really important to keep all these issues very firmly on the top of the agenda. What about you, Jen? What do you think?
I agree with that. I think the main challenge now is probably to double down and genuinely embed gender equality, just make it part of everyday normal. But I'm positive.
Good. Well, Jen, thank you very much for coming in today for this discussion for the ICMA Training and Education series, and thank you for listening.